It is 14 minutes past midnight on December the 7th, 1972. A Saturn V rocket stands on launch pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 3 men are strapped inside the capsule at the top. Gene Cernan is the commander. He's about to go to the moon for the second time. What nobody tells you about that night is what happened during the final countdown. The clock stopped. A hardware fault held the entire mission hostage for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Cernan sat in the dark and waited, and somewhere in the back of his mind he already knew that this was it. Not just his last mission, everyone's. 12 days later, when Cernan stepped off the lunar surface for the final time, he said, "We leave as we came, and God willing as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." He was wrong about the last part. It would be 53 years before any human returned to the neighbourhood of the moon. This is the story of why. Before we begin, drop your country in the comments right now. People are watching this from every corner of the planet tonight, and I want to see exactly where you are joining from. There is a moment in every journey when the traveller understands without being told that this is the last time. Not because anything has been announced, not because a door has closed or a voice has said so, but because the body knows. The weight of the moment settles differently from all the others that came before it, and the traveller finds himself paying attention in a way he never had to before, cataloguing details with the particular care of a person who suspects he will not be back. Gene Cernan had that moment somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, on the outbound leg to the moon, in December of 1972. He was 38 years old, which is a different kind of 58, the kind that comes from flying experimental aircraft at the edge of their performance envelopes and surviving, from spending 2 hours and 8 minutes outside a spacecraft in orbit with a manoeuvring unit that nearly killed him, from orbiting the moon in May of 1969 without being allowed to land on it. That last one had defined him in ways he never fully resolved. He had been so close, 69,000 feet above the surface, close enough to see individual craters, close enough that the mission was called a dress rehearsal, and then he had come home without touching the ground. A man who orbits the moon without landing on it carries that with him. It sharpens into a specific kind of unfinished business that does not soften with time. Cernan was born in Chicago in 1934, the son of a Czech-Slovak father and a Slovak mother. He became a naval aviator because naval aviators flew the fastest machines the world had yet produced, and he became an astronaut because astronauts flew faster still. He was selected in the third group of NASA astronauts in 1963, alongside people who would become household names: Pete Conrad, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, Ed White. In June of 1966, he flew Gemini 9, a mission that was supposed to be straightforward until it became the kind that tests a person's actual limits. The extravehicular activity, the spacewalk, lasted 2 hours and 8 minutes. The manoeuvring unit he was testing caused him to overheat so severely inside his suit that his visor fogged completely. He could not see. He was tumbling in the void above an Earth that had receded to the size of a palm, blind and alone. And he clawed his way back to the spacecraft using the umbilical line as a guide rope. He described it later as the moment he understood what the word alone actually meant. By the time Apollo 17 lifted from pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center, Cernan had already spent more time in space than almost any other American. But none of it was enough. None of it was the surface. The launch was scheduled for 9:53 in the evening on December the 6th, 1972. It was going to be the first American crewed launch in darkness, a logistical necessity driven by the lighting requirements of the landing site in the Taurus-Littrow Valley. But it gave the whole departure an atmosphere that the daytime launches had never carried. Fire against black sky. A column of light visible for miles in every direction along the Florida coastline. People lined up along the beaches knowing, in the way that crowds sometimes know, that they were watching something that would not come again. The countdown reached 30 seconds and stopped. The terminal countdown sequencer, the automated system that controlled the final stages of the launch, had failed to send a pressurization command to the liquid oxygen tank in the Saturn V's third stage. An alert human controller had sent the command manually. The tank had pressurized correctly. Every instrument showed normal, but the sequencer's software only recognized the commands it had sent itself, and it had not sent this one. So as far as the machine was concerned, the tank was not pressurized, the condition was not met, and the countdown could not continue. The computer had stopped the launch because a human being had correctly done its job for it, and the computer could not accept that as valid. The count was recycled to T-22 minutes, then held again at T-8 minutes while engineers worked to resolve the corrective action. Harrison Schmitt, the mission's lunar module pilot, fell asleep in his couch. Cernan sat in the dark and watched the Atlantic through his window and did the arithmetic that he had already done many times in the weeks before the flight. The missions had been cancelled. The public was somewhere else. The politicians had made their decision. This was the last one. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the first hold, at 12:33 in the morning on December the 7th, the 5 F1 engines at the base of the Saturn V ignited. From the commander's seat, Cernan and Evans could see the red glow of the engine ignition reflected in the windows of the boost protective cover. The vibration built through the structure of the spacecraft. Then the rocket lifted. It cleared the launch tower and arced eastward over the Atlantic, turning December 7th's night sky into something between a sunset and a lightning strike, lighting the coastline for 50 miles in every direction. 30,000 people watching from the beaches described it afterward in the same terms, independently, without coordination. They said it looked like sunrise. The journey to the moon took 3 days. Cernan and Schmitt landed in the Taurus-Littrow Valley in the Lunar Module Challenger at 2:55 in the afternoon, or Eastern Standard Time, on December 11th. The site had been chosen for reasons that were both scientifically ambitious and practically specific. The valley sits on the southeastern rim of the Sea of Serenity, a vast, ancient impact basin, surrounded by mountains that rise nearly 2 kilometers from the valley floor. A landslide had recently, in geological terms, deposited material from the highlands directly into the valley's lower regions, which meant the crew could sample ancient highland rock without having to drive to the mountains themselves. Alongside that ancient material, the valley showed evidence of relatively recent volcanic activity, young by the moon's standards, which meant the site compressed billions of years of lunar geological history into a single accessible location. Harrison Schmitt was the first and only professional geologist to walk on the surface of the moon. Every other Apollo moonwalker had been trained as a field geologist, trained well, in intensive programs that produced capable observers, but Schmitt had a doctorate in geology from Harvard and had spent years doing geological fieldwork before he ever became an astronaut. He saw the surface differently. On the second moonwalk at a small crater named Shorty, Schmitt stopped the rover and looked at the ground. The soil was orange, not reddish-brown, not slightly discoloured. Orange, vivid and unmistakable against the grey dust that covered everything else in the valley. Cernan confirmed it. Sparklies in the soil, as he put it, catching the sunlight like glass beads. Schmitt knelt and scooped a sample. The orange soil turned out to be volcanic glass. Tiny spheres of material erupted from the lunar interior and flash-cooled in the vacuum 3.6 billion years ago. The discovery rewrote the timeline of the moon's volcanic history, providing evidence that volcanic activity had continued far longer than previous models had predicted. It is considered one of the most significant geological finds of the entire Apollo program. Schmitt found it because he was a geologist first and an astronaut second, and because he knew what to look for when the ground was not the colour it was supposed to be. 3 moonwalks, 22 hours and 5 minutes of total surface time, and 30 kilometers of distance covered in the lunar roving vehicle, the farthest any human being has ever travelled from their spacecraft on the surface of another world. 382 kilograms of samples collected and packed into the ascent stage. On December 14th, at 5:45 in the afternoon, Cernan and Schmitt climbed back into the lunar module for the last time. Before he stepped off the surface, Cernan knelt and wrote his daughter Teresa's initials, TDC, in the dust. She was 9 years old. He had told her he would leave something of hers on the moon. He kept the promise. Then he stood up and said the words he had prepared weeks before the mission, because he suspected their weight and wanted to carry them carefully. "We leave as we came," he said, "and God willing as we shall return. With peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17. He stepped onto the ladder. He did not look back. The ascent stage lifted at 5:54 in the evening. The descent stage, the lower half of the lunar module left behind on the surface, sat in the Taurus-Littrow Valley with the American flag, the scientific instruments, and the last footprint still pressed into the dust. That footprint is still there. The moon has no wind, no rain, no erosion of any kind. The footprint will still be there in a million years, outlasting every institution and every argument and every budget decision that has been made before or since about whether and when and how to go back. Apollo 17 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on December 19, 1972. And then the silence began. A silence that would last 53 years, 4 months, and 13 days. Cernan said we would return. He believed it. He said it publicly for the rest of his life, until he died in January of 2017, and the astronauts had still not gone back. He was wrong about the timeline, and the reason he was wrong has almost nothing to do with technology or science, or the difficulty of the journey. The answer involves a decision made not by NASA, not by an engineer, not by a scientist, but by a president who had inherited a program he never asked for, who looked at the political landscape of 1969 and saw no reason to continue, and who set in motion a chain of events that would define American space policy for the next half-century. What Cernan could not have imagined, what no one in the space program wanted to say out loud, was that the decision to stop going to the moon had not been made in 1972. It had been made 3 years earlier, and it was made not by an engineer or a scientist, but by a president who had inherited a program he never asked for and saw no political reason to continue. Richard Nixon did not want to be the president who went to the moon. He wanted to be the president who received the men who had gone to the moon, which is a different thing entirely, and the distinction matters more than it might appear. When Nixon took office in January of 1969, the Apollo program was already in motion. Kennedy had started it, Johnson had funded it, and the machinery of the most ambitious peacetime engineering project in human history was running at full speed without any particular need for the new president's enthusiasm. Nixon inherited Apollo the way a new homeowner inherits a renovation already in progress. The walls were open, the contractors were on site, and the work was too far along to stop without enormous cost. So he let it continue, but he did not love it, and the people around him knew it. In July of 1969, when Apollo 11 reached the lunar surface, Nixon did what politicians do when history arrives uninvited on their doorstep. He claimed it. He telephoned Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin from the Oval Office while they stood on the moon, calling it the most historic phone call ever made from the White House. The line crackled across 239,000 miles of empty space, and Armstrong replied with characteristic precision, thanking the president and expressing confidence that the achievement belonged to all of humanity. Nixon beamed. He had not built the rocket. He had not funded the mission. He had not even particularly wanted the program to continue, but he was on camera and the moment was his, and he took it with both hands. 6 weeks later, in September of 1969, Nixon received the report he had requested from the Space Task Group, a committee chaired by Vice President Spiro Agnew and tasked with charting America's course in space after Apollo. The committee had worked for months and produced 3 options, each more ambitious than anything Nixon had any intention of funding. Option 1 called for a crewed Mars mission by the 1980s, a permanent lunar base, and a 50-person space station in Earth orbit, a vision of human expansion into the solar system that would have required more than doubling NASA's budget within a few years. Option 2 deferred the Mars mission, but retained the space station and lunar base. Option 3 deferred Mars indefinitely but kept the station. All 3 options required sustained, substantial investment. Nixon declined all 3 without choosing any of them, filed the report and returned his attention to Vietnam and the economy. What he said to NASA instead came through his aides. In December of 1969, one of the president's top advisors delivered the message plainly. The president did not see the need to go to the moon again, and did not have enough money within the next couple of years to support expanded space activity. The statement was not a formal announcement. It was not accompanied by a press release or a speech. It was delivered in the way that unwelcome news is often delivered inside large institutions, quietly, through intermediaries, in language calibrated to avoid the headlines that an honest declaration would have produced. But the meaning was clear enough to anyone paying attention. The moon program was over. The only remaining questions were how many missions would fly before the end, and what would come after. The cancellations arrived in stages, each one dressed in the language of fiscal responsibility and strategic prioritization. On January 4, 1970, NASA cancelled Apollo 20. The stated reason was that the agency needed the Saturn V rocket that would have carried it to launch Skylab, the experimental space station. This was true as far as it went. NASA genuinely did need the rocket, and the Saturn V assembly line had already been shut down in 1968, meaning there were only so many left. But the deeper truth was that the budget would not support both, and the administration had already decided which one mattered. The hardware for Apollo 20 was already built. The rocket existed. The spacecraft existed. The mission existed on paper in extraordinary detail, with landing sites identified and scientific objectives planned. And it was cancelled anyway, because the money that would have funded the flight was needed elsewhere, and because a president who did not see the need to go to the moon again was not going to argue for keeping the schedule intact. In September of 1970, 2 more missions were cancelled, the ones that had been renumbered to become Apollos 19 and 20 after the first cancellation. 3 missions gone. The scientific community was furious. Those missions would have used the enhanced lunar module capable of longer surface stays, the lunar roving vehicle, expanded scientific instrument packages. They would have visited sites that the remaining missions could not reach. The opposition was vocal, credible, and completely ineffective. Nixon was facing a midterm election and a recession. The great adventure of the space age was a line item in a budget that had other priorities, and it lost. By June of 1972, Nixon's private feelings had become publicly audible. At a White House dinner for the Apollo 16 astronauts, John Young, Ken Mattingly, and Charlie Duke, who had returned from the moon 2 months earlier, Nixon sat across the table from the men who had just walked on another world and told them, with a candour that is remarkable in retrospect, that the great excitement of the first space experiments had receded. He said it in the tone of a man describing the weather, not cruel, not dismissive, and simply honest about the political reality as he experienced it. The public had moved on, the ratings were down, the money was needed for programs that voters could see and touch. The astronauts smiled and ate their dinner and said nothing that would end up in the papers. 6 months before that dinner, on January 5, 1972, Nixon had announced the decision that would shape American human spaceflight for the next 4 decades. He would direct NASA to develop a reusable space transportation system, a vehicle that would launch like a rocket, reach orbit, complete its mission, and then glide back to Earth and land on a runway like an aircraft. It would be called the Space Shuttle. It would revolutionize access to space by making it routine, affordable, and sustainable. This was the official version. The actual version is more interesting and considerably less flattering. Nixon's aide John Ehrlichman would later recall that employment in the battleground states was a very important consideration in the president's mind when the shuttle decision was made. California had aerospace unemployment. Florida had aerospace unemployment. Texas had aerospace unemployment. These were not small states with marginal electoral influence. They were the states that decided presidential elections, and the aerospace workforce in each of them was watching its Apollo contracts expire with nothing on the horizon to replace them. A shuttle program meant contracts in California, processing facilities in Florida, mission control in Texas, and engine work in Alabama. It meant jobs in precisely the places where jobs were needed before the November 1972 election. Nixon won that election in the largest landslide in American history. The shuttle that was actually announced was not the shuttle that NASA's engineers had designed. The original vision called for a fully reusable system, a winged orbiter that would return to Earth and be refurbished for the next flight, launched by a piloted flyback booster that would also return under its own power and be reused. Everything would come back. Nothing would be thrown away. The cost per flight, according to NASA's projections, would be around $10 million. Development cost for the full system was estimated at $10 billion, and this is where the dream collided with the budget office. $10 billion was not going to be approved. The Nixon administration's Office of Management and Budget had its own target, something closer to $5 billion in development costs, which meant NASA had to design a cheaper system, even if a cheaper system cost more to operate in the long run. The piloted flyback booster was abandoned. In its place went solid rocket boosters, simpler, cheaper to develop, partially reusable in theory though expensive to refurbish in practice, and critically, built in Utah by a contractor whose congressional support would help smooth the program's budget approvals. The external fuel tank would be expendable, discarded on every flight. The orbiter alone would be reused. The promise NASA made to secure the program's approval was extraordinary in its ambition, and, as it turned out, in its distance from what was actually achievable. 50 flights per year, $10 million per flight, routine access to space, available to any customer with a payload and a manifest position. America's space truck ready to depart on schedule every week, carrying whatever the nation needed carried. The reality, 135 flights over 30 years at a cost of roughly $1.5 billion per flight. Not 50 flights per year, not $10 million, not routine, not affordable, not, in the end, what anyone had said it would be. The shuttle was sold to the American public as something it could never be. It was sold as a workhorse, a space bus, a democratization of orbit. Understanding what it was actually supposed to do and what it was actually designed around is the key to understanding everything that went wrong for the next 30 years. But the cost was not the worst of the shuttle's problems. The worst problem was that nobody could quite agree on what it was for. And when you build an extraordinarily expensive machine without a clear destination, you discover something uncomfortable. The machine does not justify itself. The people running it have to. And that pressure, the pressure of justifying a massive, complex, dangerous vehicle to a public that had already moved on, is where the next part of the story begins. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. If you were asked to design the most expensive machine in human history, and you were told that the machine had to justify its own existence every single year in front of a congressional committee that controlled its budget, and you were told that the machine had to be useful to the Air Force and to commercial satellite operators and to scientific researchers and to the general public simultaneously, and you were told that it had to make spaceflight look routine and safe and affordable, even if it was none of those things, what would you build? You would not build the space shuttle. Nobody with a clean sheet of paper and an honest brief would have built the space shuttle. The space shuttle was built by a committee that had already decided what the answer had to look like before the question was properly asked, and the result was a machine that spent 30 years trying to be everything to everyone and succeeding, just barely and at enormous cost, at being something for someone on most of its flights. The fundamental problem arrived before the first launch. The shuttle had been designed in theory as a ferry, a vehicle whose primary purpose was to carry crew and cargo to a space station in low Earth orbit. But the space station was not approved when the shuttle was approved. Nixon had declined the station along with everything else the Space Task Group recommended. The shuttle was supposed to serve a station that did not exist, which meant the shuttle needed a different reason to fly. Actually, it needed several different reasons because a single reason was not going to be enough to keep a program of this cost politically alive year after year. So the shuttle became something that no single engineering requirement had shaped, a universal vehicle. It would launch scientific payloads, it would deploy commercial satellites, it would carry military reconnaissance hardware for the Air Force, it would host laboratory modules for extended research missions, it would serve as a media platform carrying teachers and politicians and payload specialists alongside its professional crew. Each of these roles was real. Each of them brought constituencies who would argue for the program's budget, and each of them added requirements that made the machine more complex, more expensive, and further from the original vision of a simple, cost-effective space truck. The Air Force's involvement is worth pausing on, because it had consequences that reverberate through everything that followed. To secure Air Force support, and Air Force support meant a powerful political constituency and shared development costs, NASA agreed to design the shuttle's payload bay to accommodate military satellites. The Air Force needed a payload bay 617 centimeters in diameter and 1,800 centimeters long. This was larger than NASA's original design required. A larger payload bay meant a larger orbiter. A larger orbiter meant heavier wings. Heavier wings meant more thermal protection. More thermal protection meant more tiles. More tiles meant more complexity, more cost, more turnaround time, and more things that could go wrong on every flight. The tiles deserve their own moment, because they are the shuttle's most elegant illustration of what happens when simplicity is abandoned at the design stage. The thermal protection system that covered the orbiter's underside and leading edges consisted of approximately 24,000 individual ceramic tiles. No two tiles were identical. Each one was hand-fitted to its specific location on the spacecraft, shaped to the precise contour of the structure it covered, and bonded individually. If a tile was damaged and needed replacement, the replacement had to be made specifically for that position. You could not pull a spare from a bin and press it in. The tile had to be fabricated, fitted, bonded, cured, and inspected before the orbiter could fly again. The original turnaround forecast had assumed something closer to an airline operation: land on Tuesday, inspect and refuel, fly again on Friday. The reality, once the tiles were part of the picture, was closer to land on Tuesday, spend 6 months checking and replacing individual ceramic squares, and fly again the following spring. The first shuttle, Columbia, took 2 years to prepare for its second flight after its inaugural mission. The promised 50 flights per year was not just optimistic. It was a different reality entirely from the one that the vehicle's actual engineering required. Columbia's first flight in April of 1981 was nevertheless a genuine triumph of a particular kind. Commander John Young, who had already walked on the moon during Apollo 16, and pilot Bob Crippen rode the vehicle into orbit on April 12th and returned 2 days later to a runway landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The shuttle glided in from orbit and touched down on tarmac, after a decade of capsules splashing into the ocean and being fished out by Navy recovery teams. Here was a spacecraft that landed like an aircraft, rolled to a stop, and could theoretically be prepared for another flight. It looked, in that moment, exactly like the future it had promised to be. But looking like the future and being sustainable are different things. And in the years that followed Columbia's debut, something quieter and more insidious than a technical failure began to take hold inside the program. Success, repeated enough times, becomes its own kind of danger. As flights accumulated, the second mission, the 5th, the 10th, the shuttle kept coming home. Minor problems were discovered on every flight and resolved between missions. Tiles were found chipped and replaced. O-ring seals in the solid rocket boosters showed signs of erosion after exposure to hot combustion gases, and engineers examined the erosion, noted its extent and continued flying. Foam insulation on the external tank struck the orbiter during launch and caused tile damage, and the damage was assessed, repaired, and the foam strike classified as an acceptable anomaly. Each time the shuttle landed safely despite these issues, the issues themselves became slightly less concerning in the institutional mind. They had happened before. Nothing catastrophic had resulted. The program was running. The schedule had to be maintained. A sociologist named Diane Vaughan would later give this process a name. Studying the records of the shuttle program for a book published in 1996, she called it the normalization of deviance, the gradual process by which deviations from established safety norms become incorporated into an organization's operating assumptions, because the deviations have not yet produced disaster. The danger is not that anyone decides to ignore the problem. The danger is that the problem slowly ceases to be seen as a problem at all. It becomes background noise, it becomes the way things are, and the day it stops being background noise is the day people die. In 1985, the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, an independent group that reviewed NASA's safety practices and reported to the NASA administrator, delivered a finding that should have stopped the program cold. The shuttle, the panel concluded, was not an operational vehicle and should not be treated as one. It was a developmental system, still experimental in important respects, and the pace and pressure of the flight schedule were creating conditions that compromised the safety margins the program needed. The finding was documented, it was delivered through proper channels, it was filed in the appropriate offices, and nothing changed. The flights continued, the schedule pressures continued, the anomalies continued to accumulate and continued to be reclassified as acceptable. And in a small office at Morton Theocol's facility in Brigham City, Utah, a mechanical engineer named Roger Boisjoli was becoming increasingly certain that he understood something his organization did not want to hear. Boisjoli specialized in the O-ring seals that connected the segments of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. He had spent years studying how those seals behaved under different conditions, and the data he had accumulated told him something specific and alarming. The seals became less resilient in cold temperatures. At low enough temperatures, they lost the elasticity they needed to maintain their seal at the moment of ignition, when the booster segments flexed under the enormous stress of launch. If the temperature was cold enough, the primary seal might fail, and if the primary seal failed, the secondary seal, the backup, might not hold either. Hot combustion gases would escape through the joint, and the consequences of hot gases escaping from a solid rocket booster at full thrust did not require engineering expertise to imagine. Boisjoli wrote his concerns into the official record. He documented them. He flagged them. He was not a man who exaggerated. But before Challenger, there was a moment that almost nobody talks about. A moment when the cracks in NASA's institutional culture were visible to anyone who looked. An internal safety panel saw it in 1985. They wrote it down. Nobody listened. Boisjoli wrote his warning memo in July of 1985. 6 months later, on a cold January morning in Florida, with ice on the launch structure and the temperature at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. He stood in a conference room in Utah and fought as hard as any engineer has ever fought for a decision to be made correctly. He lost, and 7 people died because of it. The teleconference began at 8:45 in the evening on January 27, 1986. 3 locations were connected by phone line: Morton Thiokol's facility in Brigham City, Utah, where the solid rocket boosters were designed and built; NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, which supervised Thiokol's booster work; and Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the Shuttle Challenger sat on the launch pad in temperatures that had dropped through the night and were still falling. 34 people were on the call. The agenda was straightforward: a review of whether the following morning's launch should proceed. Roger Boisjoli had been preparing for this conversation for months. He had the data, he had the photographs. He had years of accumulated evidence about what cold temperatures did to the rubber O-ring seals between the booster segments, and what happened to those seals when they lost their elasticity at the moment of ignition. He had written it all down in July. He had flagged it through proper channels. He had done everything an engineer in a large institution is supposed to do when he believes a system is at risk of catastrophic failure. Now he had one more chance to say it out loud to the people with the authority to act on it. The engineer's position was unambiguous. The predicted temperature at Kennedy Space Center the following morning was 29 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 4 degrees below freezing, and well below the lowest temperature at which any shuttle had previously launched. The coldest previous launch had been at 53 degrees. Boisjoli and his colleagues had data showing that O-ring erosion was more severe at lower temperatures. They did not have enough data to say precisely what would happen at 29 degrees, because nobody had ever launched at 29 degrees. But the trend in the data was clear, and the trend pointed in one direction only. The recommendation from the engineering team was unanimous: do not launch. Lawrence Malloy of Marshall heard the recommendation and responded with a sentence that has since become one of the most quoted in the history of institutional failure. "My God, Thiokol," he said, "when do you want me to launch? Next April?" The flight manifest had already slipped. The program had been promising routine access to space for years, and the schedule pressure that promise created had become a physical force inside every meeting, every review, every decision. Malloy was not a villain. He was a program manager inside a system that had spent 4 years treating launch delays as failures and on-time launches as successes, regardless of what the engineering data said about the risks involved. He was doing what the system had trained him to do. Thiokol's management asked for time to caucus privately. The engineers' microphones were turned off. In the room in Utah, away from the Marshall and Kennedy listeners, 4 senior Thiokol managers debated what to do. One of them, Jerry Mason, said the words that would define the moment: "We have to make a management decision." He did not mean a decision informed by management, and he meant a decision made by management instead of by engineering, a deliberate override of the technical recommendation in favour of the schedule and the commercial relationship with NASA. 3 managers voted to proceed with the launch. The engineers in the room did not get a vote. Boisjoli later described the moment when he realised the decision had been made against his recommendation. He grabbed the photographs of O-ring erosion from previous flights and spread them on the table. He pointed to the data. He said, with as much force as a person can use in a professional setting, without crossing a line that would get him dismissed from the conversation entirely, that the images showed exactly what cold temperatures did to the seals. The managers listened. They made their decision. Thiokol reconnected to the conference call and told NASA that the company had reconsidered and was now recommending launch. At 11:38 in the morning on January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted from Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center. The crew was 7 people: Commander Dick Scobie, a former Air Force test pilot; pilot Michael Smith, a Navy aviator; mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, 3 of the most accomplished people in NASA's astronaut corps; payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, an engineer from Hughes Aircraft; and Krista McAuliffe, a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, selected from 11,000 applicants to be the first private citizen in space, yet chosen specifically because NASA needed the publicity and the public connection that a teacher would provide. School children across America were watching in their classrooms. McAuliffe's students were watching. Her parents were watching from the viewing stands at Kennedy. 73 seconds after launch, pilot Michael Smith said 2 words. The voice recorder captured them clearly. Uh-oh. At ignition, the cold had done exactly what Boisjoli had predicted it would do. The primary O-ring on the right solid rocket booster had failed to seal. Hot combustion gases had burned through the joint. At first, the escaping gas formed a small plume, visible in the launch footage as a dark smear against the white exhaust. Then the plume grew. It reached the strut connecting the booster to the external fuel tank and burned through it. The booster rotated into the tank. The tank ruptured. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, carrying enough energy to push 250,000 kilograms of spacecraft off the ground, mixed and ignited in an instant. The vehicle came apart at an altitude of approximately 14 kilometers, traveling at nearly 2,000 kilometers per hour. 7 people died. Their names are Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. In the conference room in Utah, Roger Boisjoli was watching the launch on television with his colleagues. When Challenger came apart on the screen in front of him, he turned away from the television. He could not watch. "I had predicted it," he said later. "I had done everything I could to stop it. And it happened anyway." He resigned from Morton Thiokol in the months that followed. He spent the rest of his working life as a lecturer on engineering ethics, travelling to universities and professional organisations to tell the story of what happens when the obligation to speak clearly is overridden by the pressure to accommodate a decision that has already been made. He received the Award for Scientific Freedom and Responsibility from the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1988. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, and a member of the Rogers Commission that investigated the disaster, gave him a hug after his testimony. He said later that she was the only one who did. The Rogers Commission, convened by President Reagan and chaired by former Secretary of State William Rogers, investigated the disaster over the following months and produced a report that was damning in its clarity. The O-ring failure was the physical cause, but the Commission found something beyond the physical cause, a management culture at NASA that had allowed the normalization of O-ring erosion, that had created pressure on engineers and contractors to accommodate launch schedules rather than resolve technical concerns, and that had suppressed dissenting technical opinion through organizational dynamics rather than through any explicit instruction. The Commission recommended changes to NASA's decision-making processes, its communication structures, its safety oversight. The Shuttle fleet was grounded for 2 years and 8 months while the recommendations were implemented. When the Shuttle returned to flight in September of 1988, it was a change program in many procedural respects. The O-ring joints had been redesigned, communication protocols had been revised, safety review processes had been restructured. The changes were real, and they were implemented with genuine commitment by people who understood what had gone wrong and wanted it not to go wrong again. But the underlying pressure did not change, because the underlying pressure was not procedural. It lived in the economic and political structure of the program itself, in the need to maintain flight rates, justify budgets, satisfy customers, and demonstrate to Congress every year that the Shuttle was earning its extraordinary cost. You could redesign an O-ring joint. You could not, with a memo or a procedure or a safety board, redesign the institutional incentives that had caused the joint's warning signs to be ignored in the first place. 17 years passed. 112 more shuttle flights flew without a fatal accident. And then, on the morning of February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia began its re-entry over the Pacific Ocean at the end of a 16-day scientific research mission. 16 days earlier, 81 seconds after launch, a piece of foam insulation approximately the size of a laptop computer had broken free from the bipod ramp on the external fuel tank and struck the leading edge of the orbiter's left wing. The foam had been travelling at roughly 500 km per hour relative to the wing at the moment of impact. It left a hole. Engineers within NASA had seen the foam strike on launch footage and requested satellite imagery to assess the damage. Their requests moved through channels, encountered organisational resistance, and were ultimately dismissed. The mission management team had decided that the foam strike was not a safety of flight concern before any definitive assessment had been completed. An engineer who sent an email expressing concern was told by a manager that the team had already reached its conclusion. The culture that the Rogers Commission had described in 1986, the culture in which engineers had to prove danger rather than prove safety, in which dissenting technical opinion was filtered before reaching decision makers, in which past successes were treated as evidence that known anomalies were acceptable, that culture was still there. Columbia entered the atmosphere. Superheated plasma, at temperatures approaching 15,000 degrees Celsius, entered the hole in the wing. The wing's internal structure failed. The orbiter broke apart over Texas and Louisiana at an altitude of approximately 63 kilometers, spreading debris across 2 states. 7 people died. Their names are Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, in its report released in August of 2003, used language that left no room for ambiguity. NASA's organizational culture, the board concluded, had as much to do with the accident as the foam. The board found that the causes of the Challenger disaster had not been fixed. 17 years of procedural reform had not reached the level at which the problem actually lived. The board called them failures of foresight. The same failures, in the same institution, producing the same outcome, a generation apart. 2 programs, 14 crew members, the same problem, unaddressed twice. The investigation that followed Columbia would find something the Rogers Commission had already found 17 years earlier. The same findings, the same culture, the same failure to learn. There is a word for an organization that makes the same catastrophic mistake twice, 17 years apart. That word is relevant to everything that comes after. The Columbia investigation grounded the shuttle fleet for 2 years and 6 months. When it returned to flight in 2005, it was a different program, more cautious, more watched, more expensive, and running out of time. President George W. Bush had already announced what would come next. He called it Constellation. It was going to take America back to the moon by 2020, and for 5 years it was the most ambitious thing NASA had attempted since Apollo. Then it was cancelled, and $9 billion disappeared. On January 14, 2004, President George W. Bush stood at NASA headquarters in Washington and did something that American presidents do when they want to associate themselves with greatness. He invoked John Kennedy. Not by name, necessarily, though Kennedy was present in the architecture of the speech, by structure, by the form of the thing, a national commitment, a named destination, a deadline that extended beyond the current presidency and would therefore require successors to honour it. Kennedy had said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade." Bush said, "We will return to the moon by 2020, and from there we will set our sights on Mars." The parallel was deliberate. The ambition was genuine, and the gap between the announcement and the reality of funding it would prove, over the following 6 years, to be the same gap that had swallowed every ambitious American space program since Apollo. The gap between what a president can say at a podium and what a Congress will actually appropriate year after year after year. The program Bush announced was called Constellation. Its architecture was coherent in a way that the Space Shuttle program had never quite managed to be, because it was designed around a specific destination rather than around a political compromise. There would be a new crew capsule called Orion, larger than the Apollo command module and capable of carrying 4 astronauts rather than 3. There would be a medium-lift rocket called Ares-1, dedicated solely to launching the Orion capsule and its crew to low Earth orbit, simpler and safer than the shuttle because it carried only people and not cargo. And there would be a heavy-lift rocket called Ares-5, the workhorse of the architecture, capable of lifting 188 metric tons to low Earth orbit, which was substantially more than the Saturn V's 118 metric tons, and more than enough to carry the lunar lander, the departure stage, and everything else needed for a surface mission. The lunar lander itself was called Altair. The design philosophy behind separating crew from cargo was explicitly a response to the shuttle's fatal flaw. On the shuttle, crew and cargo rode together in the same vehicle, which meant that any failure during ascent, a tank rupture, a foam strike, a booster failure, put the crew directly in the path of the debris field that the failure created. There was no escape system capable of pulling the crew clear. Constellation addressed this by putting the crew on a separate, smaller rocket with a launch abort system capable of yanking the Orion capsule away from a failing booster in the first seconds of flight. Cargo would travel separately, on the Ares-5, without anyone aboard. If the heavy-lift rocket failed, you lost the hardware. You did not lose the people. This was sound engineering logic, and the engineers who designed Constellation were not fools. They were working towards something genuinely more capable than what had come before, and they were doing it with a coherent design philosophy that the shuttle had never had. Ares-5's projected payload capacity would have made missions possible that the shuttle could not even attempt. The architecture on paper was more ambitious than Apollo, but a program is not its architecture. A program is its budget, its schedule, and the political environment it has to survive in year after year. And Constellation's budget problem arrived before the first component had been completed. The funding that was supposed to pay for Constellation's development depended on the Space Shuttle program ending. Bush had announced that the shuttle would retire once construction of the International Space Station was complete, freeing up the shuttle's operating budget, approximately $4 to $5 billion per year, to be redirected toward Constellation's development. The problem was that ISS completion kept slipping. Technical delays, international coordination issues, and the 2.5-year grounding of the shuttle fleet after Columbia all pushed the station's completion date further into the future. The shuttle kept flying. Its budget kept being spent. The money that was supposed to flow to Constellation did not flow, because the shuttle still needed it. By 2008, Constellation was 4 years behind its own schedule and consuming significantly more than its original budget allocation. The Orus-1 rocket, the simpler of the two boosters, had developed an unexpected vibration problem during testing, a resonance effect in the solid motor that threatened to shake the vehicle to pieces during first-stage flight. Engineers were working on solutions, but solutions cost money and time, and both were already in short supply. The Ares-5 heavy-lift rocket, which was the heart of the lunar return architecture, had not yet entered serious development because there was not enough budget to run both programs simultaneously. In May of 2009, President Barack Obama, 5 months into office, commissioned an independent review of NASA's human spaceflight plans. The review panel was chaired by Norman Augustin, the former chief executive of Lockheed Martin, and included 10 experts drawn from industry, academia, and the policy world. They spent 5 months examining the program in detail: the technical plans, the cost estimates, the schedule projections, the funding assumptions. Their report arrived in October of 2009, and it was 157 pages of careful, thorough, devastating analysis. The findings were unambiguous. Constellation was behind schedule by at minimum 4 years in several essential components. It was underfunded by a margin that made its stated goals unachievable, without additional investment that the administration had not requested and Congress had not approved. The Ares-1 rocket, the simpler and more advanced of the two boosters, would not be operational for crewed missions before 2017 at the earliest, which was 3 years after the shuttle's planned retirement, meaning there would be a gap of at least 3 years during which America had no domestic capability to launch its own astronauts. A return to the moon was not realistically possible before 2028 under the most favourable budget assumptions, and those assumptions required increases in NASA's funding that the Commission considered unlikely to materialise. The Commission did not say the goals were wrong. It said the goals were not matched to the resources. That is a different kind of failure, more mundane and more honest than a technical breakdown, and harder to fix because it lives in the political process rather than in the engineering. On February 1st, 2010, the 7th anniversary of the Columbia disaster, a date that was either a coincidence or a piece of unsubtle symbolism depending on your view of how these things happen in Washington, Barack Obama released his proposed budget for the following fiscal year. Constellation was not in it. The program that had spent $9 billion over 5 years, that had produced one Ares-1 test flight, or one Orion capsule test article, and no crewed missions, was cancelled. Root and branch. No crew had ever flown on any Constellation vehicle. The reaction from the people who had built the program was swift and unsparing. Neil Armstrong, the first human to walk on the moon, Gene Cernan, the last, and Jim Lovell, whose near-fatal Apollo 13 mission had demonstrated both the courage of the people who flew these vehicles and the fragility of the systems that carried them, sent an open letter to the president. Armstrong, who had maintained an almost total public silence on space policy since leaving NASA, called the decision a deeply flawed approach that was devastating to the national aspiration in space. Cernan was blunter in subsequent interviews. Lovell, characteristically measured, said that the country was on the wrong path. 3 of the most admired figures in American aviation and spaceflight history had looked at the decision and found it wanting. Obama responded by inviting Buzz Aldrin, Armstrong's crewmate on Apollo 11, and a man who had taken a distinctly different public position on the program's direction, to stand beside him at a speech at Kennedy Space Center in April. The symbolism was deliberate. If Armstrong represented the old vision, Aldrin represented the willingness to embrace a new one. Obama committed to increased NASA funding, commercial crew development, a crewed asteroid mission by 2025, and a crewed Mars mission in the mid-2030s. What he did not provide was a specific rocket, a specific lander, a specific destination with a specific date. He provided a framework, ambitious in its language, disciplined in its budget, and defined by the careful avoidance of the kind of concrete commitment that would bind future administrations to specific hardware programs. Congress received this framework and responded with something between fury and determination. The senators from Florida and Texas, Kay Bailey Hutchison of Texas, Bill Nelson of Florida, Richard Shelby of Alabama, were not interested in a framework. They were interested in the tens of thousands of aerospace jobs in their states that Constellation's cancellation had just put at risk, and they were interested in ensuring that whatever came next would employ the same contractors, use the same facilities, and preserve the same industrial base that the Shuttle and Constellation had sustained for decades. They moved immediately to rebuild. Not Constellation exactly. Constellation was politically associated with the previous administration and had too many documented failures to revive under its own name, but something that used Constellation's parts, Constellation's contractors, Constellation's workforce. The cancellation of Constellation was not the end of the story. What Congress did next, in 2010, is the decision that explains why Artemis II is in the air right now and why it looks the way it does. Before we get to what Congress built, and we will get there, because it is the most consequential and the most contested piece of this entire story, we need to spend a moment on something that the political and engineering history tends to skip past. We need to talk about what 50 years of moon silence did to the people watching from below. There is a particular quality to silence that arrives after something extraordinary has ended. It is not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of everyone quietly agreeing not to talk about the fact that something extraordinary has stopped. That is the silence that settled over human spaceflight after December 19th, 1972. Not immediately. There were missions and programs and announcements and press conferences in the years that followed. The shuttle flew, Skylab orbited, astronauts went to space regularly, reliably, professionally. But they went to low Earth orbit, 400 kilometers up, close enough that on a clear night you can watch the International Space Station cross the sky from your backyard. A moving point of light indistinguishable from a slow aircraft if you do not know what to look for. The Moon, by comparison, is 239,000 miles away. The distance between 400 kilometers and 239,000 miles is not a gap. It is a different category of ambition entirely. And after 1972, that category went quiet. The generation born in the 1970s and 80s grew up knowing the moon landings as history. Not recent history, the kind that still smells of the present, that adults talk about in the present tense because it has not yet fully become the past. Historical history, the kind taught in school between other events of similar distance, framed in black and white footage and the particular reverence reserved for things that happened before you were born and will not happen again in your lifetime. The moon, for this generation, was not a destination. It was a memory belonging to other people. It was something that America had done once, impressively, in a different era, for reasons that were themselves historical. The Cold War, Kennedy's speech, the space race, and that had since been resolved in America's favour, which meant there was no longer any particular urgency to repeat the exercise. This is not a criticism of the generation. It is a description of the information environment in which they formed their sense of what was possible. You cannot aspire to something that no institution around you is actively attempting. You can admire it, romanticize it, or watch the old footage and feel the old feeling, but admiration and aspiration are different things, and the culture of the 1980s and 90s was producing the former while quietly abandoning the latter. Into this mood came Carl Sagan on February 14th, 1990. On that day, at Sagan's request, NASA commanded the Voyager 1 spacecraft to turn its camera back toward the inner solar system from a distance of approximately 6 billion kilometers beyond Neptune, beyond the edge of the known planetary neighborhood, and take a photograph of Earth. What the camera recorded was almost nothing. Earth appeared as a single pixel of light, pale blue, less than a twelfth of a pixel across, suspended in a beam of scattered sunlight. Sagan called it the pale blue dot. In the passage he wrote about it, one of the most quoted pieces of scientific writing of the late 20th century, He described humanity's history of conflict and conquest and ambition as taking place on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The image was extraordinary precisely because of what it erased. From 6 billion kilometers away, there are no countries, there are no borders, there are no launch pads, there is only the dot. Sagan intended the image as a call to perspective, to humility, to the recognition of human fragility and the preciousness of the only home we have. And it worked. The image changed how many people thought about Earth and about themselves. But it also captured something about where the cultural energy of space exploration had migrated. The ambition had turned inward. Instead of asking how far we could go, the most resonant space imagery of the era was asking what we looked like from far away. The direction of gaze had reversed. We were no longer reaching out. We were looking back. The International Space Station arrived in this cultural moment as the compromise it was always going to be. Assembly began in November of 1998 with the launch of the Russian Zarya module, and the station grew over the following decade into the largest structure humans had ever assembled in orbit. A complex of pressurized modules, solar arrays, truss segments, and docking ports representing contributions from 17 nations and several $100 billion of combined investment. It is, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary achievement. Astronauts have lived aboard it continuously since November of 2000, a presence in space that has now lasted more than a quarter of a century without interruption. But it orbits at 400 kilometers altitude, and it does not go anywhere. It circles the Earth every 90 minutes, travelling at 28,000 kilometers per hour, covering the same ground over and over. The people aboard it conduct science, maintain systems, exercise to counteract the physiological effects of weightlessness, and look out the cupola window at the planet below. What they do not do is explore. The station is a laboratory, not a vehicle. It is a permanent outpost in the most accessible region of space, which is also the region of space that offers the least in the way of new horizons. The compromise at its heart: 17 nations, shared costs, shared governance, shared risk, shared limitations, is a political masterpiece and an exploratory dead end. No one nation controls it well enough to point it somewhere new, and no agreement among all 17 can produce the kind of focused ambition that got 12 people to the surface of the Moon. The Hubble Space Telescope offered a different consolation. Launched in April of 1990 and repaired by Shuttle astronauts in December of 1993 after its flawed mirror was corrected, Hubble returned images that redefined what humanity could see. Galaxies forming in the early universe, the pillars of creation in the Eagle Nebula, the deep field images showing thousands of galaxies in a patch of sky, the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length. The science was staggering. The images were beautiful in a way that required no scientific background to appreciate, and they were produced without putting a human being anywhere near them. This is the implicit argument that the unmanned program made quietly and cumulatively persuasively throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Robots could do this. Probes and telescopes and rovers could conduct science of extraordinary depth and quality in environments that would kill a person in seconds. The Hubble did not need a human to point it. The Mars rovers did not need a human to drive them. The Voyager spacecraft, still transmitting from beyond the solar system, had been flying for decades without anyone aboard. Why risk a person? Why spend 20 times as much to achieve the same scientific result when the machines were doing so well on their own? It was a reasonable question. It was also a question that quietly redefined exploration as a purely scientific enterprise, stripping it of the human element that had made Apollo something more than a data collection exercise. People had not gone to the Moon only for the rocks. They had gone because going itself meant something, about courage, about curiosity, about the kind of species we were capable of being on our best days. When exploration became synonymous with the work that instruments could do, that dimension of the argument went quiet along with everything else. The private sector, meanwhile, was beginning to ask different questions. SpaceX's first attempt to reach orbit came in August of 2006 with the Falcon 1 rocket, and it failed. The second attempt in March of 2007 failed. The third, in August of 2008, failed. And then, on September 28th of 2008, the fourth Falcon 1 launch succeeded. A company that had not existed a decade earlier had built a rocket from scratch, failed 3 times, and kept going. In May of 2012, the the Dragon capsule became the first commercial spacecraft to deliver cargo to the International Space Station. The economics of space access, which government programs had treated as a fixed and unavoidable reality, were not fixed. They were an engineering problem, and engineering problems had solutions if you were willing to iterate fast enough and fail cheaply enough to learn. But in the years between Apollo 17 and the emergence of commercial spaceflight, public opinion on the moon had settled into a particular and revealing shape. Survey after survey found the same pattern. Most Americans believed returning to the moon was a worthwhile goal. Most Americans also believed it should not be a spending priority compared to healthcare, education, infrastructure, and economic security. The emotional resonance of the Apollo story was intact. People felt something when they watched the old footage, when they heard the radio transmissions, when they saw photographs of the lunar surface with footprints pressed into grey dust. But feeling something and funding something are different activities, and the gap between them is where the moon program spent 50 years. This is why what Congress did in 2010 matters beyond its technical consequences. The political machine that produced the Space Launch System was not operating in a vacuum. It was operating in a culture that had stopped believing the moon was reachable in any reasonable time frame. And when people stop believing something is reachable, they build the structures that confirm the belief. Into this atmosphere, a public that had moved on, a commercial sector beginning to challenge the assumptions of government spaceflight, and a Congress that had just watched $9 billion disappear without a single crew leaving Earth, a group of senators sat down to write a law, and they wrote it the way senators write things. Not around the question of what would work best, but around the question of what would keep the most people employed in the most important electoral districts. On October 11, 2010, President Obama signed the NASA Authorization Act of 2010 into law. It was not a particularly dramatic moment in the public record. No primetime address, no Rose Garden ceremony with astronauts standing in rows behind the president. It was a piece of legislation, signed in the ordinary way that legislation is signed, and it received the ordinary level of public attention that space policy legislation typically receives, which is to say, almost none. But buried in Section 304 of that law was a passage that would determine the shape of American human spaceflight for the next 15 years and counting. The passage read, in the careful language of federal statute, that in developing the Space Launch System and the multi-purpose crew vehicle, the NASA administrator shall, to the extent practicable, utilize existing contracts, investments, workforce, industrial base, and capabilities from the Space Shuttle and Orion and Ares 1 projects, including Space Shuttle-derived components that use existing United States propulsion systems. Read that slowly because every word is doing work. Existing contracts, existing workforce, existing industrial base, shuttle-derived components, existing propulsion systems. The legislation was not telling NASA what mission to accomplish. It was telling NASA what parts to use, what factories to keep open, what workforce to preserve, and what contractors to retain. The rocket that emerged from this instruction was not designed around the question of what configuration of hardware would most effectively and affordably send humans to the moon. It was designed around the question of what configuration of hardware would employ the people who were already employed, in the states that were already politically significant, using the contracts that were already in place. The result was the Space Launch System. The RS-25 engines that power the Space Launch System's core stage are the main engines that flew on the Space Shuttle for 30 years. They are among the most tested and reliable liquid-fueled rocket engines ever built, with hundreds of thousands of seconds of accumulated test and flight time. They are also engines that were designed in the 1970s for a vehicle that no longer exists, manufactured for a program that ended in 2011, and now expended on every SLS flight rather than recovered and reused the way they were on the shuttle. The solid rocket boosters flanking the core stage are the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, the same basic design, the same contractor, the same Utah facility where Roger Boisjoli once worked, the same components that failed on Challenger in January of 1986 and were subsequently redesigned. They are now 5-segment rather than 4-segment, which increases their thrust, but their lineage is unmistakable. The manufacturing facilities that build the Space Launch System's core stage are the same facilities that built shuttle components. The Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, Louisiana, which fabricates the core stage, was the facility that built the shuttle's external tank. The Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, which tests the RS-25 engines, tested the shuttle's engines. The Kennedy Space Center infrastructure that processes and launches the vehicle uses modified Shuttle-era facilities. The workforce that assembles, tests and launches the Space Launch System is, to a substantial degree, the workforce that assembled, tested and launched the Space Shuttle. The Planetary Society, after analysing the program's political and economic structure in detail, concluded that it was not too much of a simplification to say that the Space Launch System is the modern implementation of the Space Shuttle workforce. That sentence is worth reading twice because it is both accurate and clarifying. The Space Launch System is not primarily a vehicle designed to reach the Moon. It is primarily a mechanism for preserving the industrial and employment base of the Shuttle program in the political geography that matters most to the senators who wrote the law that created it. Those senators were not operating without self-interest. Richard Shelby of Alabama represented a state that contains Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, the center responsible for SLS development and engine testing. Bill Nelson of Florida represented a state that contains Kennedy Space Center, where the vehicle is processed and launched. Kay Bailey Hutchison of Texas represented a state that contains Johnson Space Center in Houston, where mission control operates and where astronauts train. These three senators, and others from states with significant aerospace footprints, drove the legislation that created the SLS. The Planetary Society's analysis confirmed that the program touches contractors in more than 40 states, a geographic distribution that was not an accident of engineering, but a feature of political design, ensuring that enough members of Congress had a constituency interest in the program's continuation that cancelling it would be politically costly, regardless of which party held the majority. This is the same logic that governed the Space Shuttle contract in 1972. When Rockwell International was awarded the orbiter contract that year, its proposal had not ranked first on technical merit. It won partly because of its emphasis on cost controls, and partly because it planned to subcontract work among companies across the country. The more of the shuttle's budget that could be spread across congressional districts, the more smoothly future budget approvals would go. The Space Launch System repeated this logic with the precision of institutional memory. It was not designed to be the most capable or the most cost-effective rocket that American engineering could produce in 2010. It was designed to be the rocket that would survive the next budget cycle, and the one after that, and the one after that. Representative Tom McClintock of California saw this immediately. Within weeks of the authorization being signed, he called on the Government Accountability Office to investigate whether the law's requirement that NASA use shuttle-derived components violated the Competition in Contracting Act, the federal statute that requires government procurement to be conducted through open competition rather than directed to specific suppliers. His argument was straightforward. Requiring NASA to use shuttle-era components and shuttle-era contractors was not a competitive procurement. It was a directed award, dressed in the language of engineering requirement. The investigation found no violation. But the reason it found no violation was not that McClintock was wrong about what the law did. It was that Congress had explicitly required it. The requirement was not a circumvention of the law. It was the law. You cannot violate a statute by following a statute. The circular protection was built in from the beginning. The cost of this political durability is specific and large. NASA's own Office of Inspector General has estimated the cost of each Space Launch System launch, including the rocket, the Orion spacecraft, and the ground systems required to process and launch the stack, at $4.1 billion. The Saturn V, the rocket that sent 12 people to the surface of the Moon across 6 missions, cost approximately $1.5 billion per launch, in money adjusted to 2026 values. The Saturn V delivered 48,600 kilograms to translunar injection, the trajectory that sends a spacecraft toward the Moon. The Space Launch System, Block 1, the version currently flying, delivers 27,000 kilograms to the same trajectory. That is 44% less payload for nearly 3 times the cost per flight. And because the Space Launch System delivers 44% less than Saturn V, it cannot carry everything a lunar mission requires in a single launch. The Saturn V carried the crew capsule, the service module, and the lunar lander all at once. One rocket, one launch, one stack pointed at the Moon. The Space Launch System carries Orion and its service module, and essentially nothing else. The lunar lander must be launched separately, on a commercial rocket, and the 2 vehicles must rendezvous in lunar orbit before any crew can descend to the surface. This is why Artemis 3 requires SpaceX to launch Starship, why it requires a propellant depot in orbit, and a sequence of 14 or more tanker flights to fuel the lander before a crew can use it. The complexity of the Artemis architecture is not a choice NASA made because it was the most elegant solution. It is a consequence of the payload limitation of a rocket that was designed around a supply chain rather than around a mission. During the floor debate on the Authorization Act in 2010, a member of Congress described the Space Launch System as a rocket designed by senators and not by engineers, a rocket that does not meet NASA's needs. The remark was recorded in the congressional record. The member's name was not attached to it in subsequent reporting, lost in the ordinary way that floor statements are lost when they are inconvenient to the record of people still in office. But the observation has proven accurate in every particular. The Space Launch System is a rocket designed by senators, built around the requirements of the political system rather than the requirements of the mission, and sustained by the same geographic distribution of contracts and jobs that has kept every major NASA program alive through administrations of both parties for the past 50 years. None of which means it does not work. The Space Launch System worked. That is the thing nobody expected, or at least nobody said loudly enough to be heard over the criticism. It launched in November of 2022 on its first test flight, performed within its design specifications, sent an uncrewed Orion capsule on a 25-day journey around the Moon and back, and demonstrated that the basic architecture was flight-worthy. And in April of 2026, it put 4 people beyond low Earth orbit for the first time in 53 years. A rocket designed to be politically durable turned out to also be technically functional. But the cost of that functionality, in money, in time, in the missions that could not fly because $4.1 billion per launch is what a launch costs, is the question that Artemis 3 and every mission after will have to answer. That is the foundation on which Artemis was built. Not an engineering foundation, a political one. And when you build a moon program on a political foundation, the question is not whether it will work. The question is whether it will survive long enough to matter. Because in the history of American lunar ambitions, nothing has been harder than simply enduring. On December 11, 2017, President Donald Trump sat at a desk in the Oval Office and signed a document called Space Policy Directive 1. The signing was brief and ceremonial. Astronauts stood behind the president, including Buzz Aldrin, who had been present at enough of these moments to understand their relationship to what actually happens afterward. The directive instructed NASA to lead an innovative and sustainable program of exploration, with commercial and international partners to enable human expansion across the solar system. It called for a return to the Moon, followed by missions to Mars and beyond. It did not specify a rocket. It did not specify a lander. It did not specify a timeline with funded milestones attached to it. It was a direction, or as not a plan, a statement of intent from an administration that understood the political value of associating itself with the aspiration of lunar return without committing to the specific, expensive, contentious decisions that turning aspiration into hardware actually requires. The Space Launch System existed. The Orion capsule existed in development. A human landing system did not exist, even in contract form. The suits that astronauts would wear on the surface had not been designed. The program did not yet have a name. The name arrived in May of 2019, when NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine announced that the lunar return effort would be called Artemis, the goddess of the moon in Greek mythology, twin sister of Apollo, a name chosen with the explicit intention of honouring both the legacy of the original program and the stated goal of landing the first woman on the lunar surface. The naming was a genuine piece of institutional poetry, and it gave the program an identity that Constellation had never quite achieved. Artemis felt like something. It had shape and resonance and the kind of cultural weight that helps a program survive the grinding years of development when nothing spectacular is happening and the budget is always under pressure. 10 weeks before the name was announced on March 26, 2019, Vice President Mike Pence stood before the National Space Council at the United States Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and delivered a deadline that restructured every timeline in the program. Americans, or Pence said, would return to the moon by 2024. Not the late 2020s, which was where NASA's internal planning had been pointing. Not 2028, which the agency considered achievable with sufficient funding and no major technical surprises. 2024, 4 years from the announcement, the most aggressive crewed lunar deadline since Kennedy had committed to the end of the 1960s in May of 1961. NASA's internal planning had been targeting 2028, because 2028 was what the hardware development schedules, the budget projections, and the honest assessment of remaining technical challenges actually supported. Pence gave the agency 4 years to do what its own engineers had calculated would take 9. A senior NASA manager at the time, Douglas Lovero, made himself a pin showing the number of days remaining until December 31, 2024, and wore it on his lapel during visits to the NASA workforce. He updated it daily. He said he did not want to tell people to rush, only to make every day count. It was the kind of gesture that captures the particular atmosphere of a program being pushed faster than its foundations can support. Earnest, motivated, and already behind before it had properly begun. The 2024 target was not realistic, and the people in the best position to assess it said so clearly and early. NASA's own Office of Inspector General published a report in 2021 concluding that a 2024 landing was not feasible. Independent analysts reached the same conclusion through different routes. The first Artemis landing required a human landing system, a lunar lander, that in 2024 did not yet exist in hardware form. SpaceX had been awarded the contract to develop Starship as NASA's human landing system in April of 2021, but Starship was still in its early testing phase, exploding on the pad and learning from each explosion in the iterative way that SpaceX had made its operating philosophy. The spacesuits that astronauts would wear on the surface had not been designed to the point of production readiness. The upper stage for the space launch system that would be needed for later, more complex missions was behind schedule, and the heat shield on the Orion capsule had not yet been tested in the conditions that a lunar return mission would actually create. That last item became the defining technical problem of the program's middle years. The Artemis 1 mission, which launched on November 16, 2022, was the first flight of the Space Launch System, uncrewed, a 25-and-a-half-day journey that sent Orion around the Moon and back to Earth at lunar return velocity. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a success. The rocket performed within its specifications. The capsule reached the Moon, flew to a distance of approximately 430,000 kilometers from Earth, the farthest any spacecraft designed to carry humans had ever traveled, and returned. It worked. But when engineers examined the heat shield after splashdown, they found something the models had not predicted. The ablative material called avcoat, a substance designed to burn away in a controlled, uniform fashion during re-entry, carrying thermal energy away from the capsule as it does so, had not behaved uniformly. Pieces had cracked and separated in patterns that the pre-flight simulations had not foreseen. The material had charred and spalled in ways that created uneven heating across the shield's surface. NASA's subsequent investigation identified 3 specific mechanisms by which this behavior could kill a crew: a direct breach in the thermal protection, allowing plasma to reach the capsule structure, debris from the separating material striking the parachute risers during descent, and structural damage from asymmetric heating loads that the capsule had not been designed to withstand. The response to this finding was not a redesign. There was not enough time or money for a redesign. The response was a modified re-entry trajectory, a shallower approach angle, a different skip profile, adjustments to the geometry of the capsule's passage through the atmosphere, intended to reduce the peak thermal stress on the material without changing the material itself, the same heat shield, a different angle, and 4 human lives on Artemis 2 as the first test of whether the different angle is enough. This is where the 50-year story of compromise and political engineering and institutional dysfunction becomes quite suddenly personal. The heat shield on the Orion capsule carrying Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen is the product of every decision traced in this video. It is the product of Nixon's budget cuts, and the Shuttle compromise and the normalization of deviance, and the $9 billion that Constellation spent without flying a crew, and the 2010 Authorization Act that told NASA what parts to use. All of that history is concentrated right now in a layer of ablative material approximately 8 centimeters thick on the base of a spacecraft moving at 40,000 kilometers per hour toward the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, the geopolitical dimension of the story, dormant since the Soviet Union collapsed and the space race ended in American victory, has returned with a directness that Washington had not anticipated. The Chinese National Space Administration has publicly committed to a crewed lunar landing by 2030. This is not an aspiration without substance. In January of 2019, China's Chang'e 4 spacecraft became the first in history to land on the far side of the Moon, a technical achievement that required the deployment of a relay satellite in lunar orbit to maintain communications, a capability no other nation had previously demonstrated. In June of 2024, Chang'e 6 returned approximately 1,900 grams of material from the far side, the first samples ever collected from that hemisphere. China is building toward a crewed landing with the methodical incrementalism of a program that does not announce deadlines it cannot keep, and it is building an architecture that does not depend on a single rocket costing $4.1 billion per flight. NASA Administrator Sean Duffy said it plainly in October of 2025 when he threatened to open the Starship lunar lander contract to competing bidders because SpaceX's development timeline had slipped. I love SpaceX. It's an amazing company. The problem is, they're behind. They've pushed their timelines out and we're in a race against China. The race that Nixon had decided in 1969 was no longer worth running has, 55 years later, resumed. Artemis 3, as of April of 2026, is targeting 2027, not a landing but a rendezvous and docking test in low Earth orbit, with one or both of the commercial lunar landers under development. Artemis 4, currently targeting 2028, is the first mission that might actually put people on the surface. If it does, the first lunar landing since December of 1972 will have taken 56 years. If it does not, if the landers are not ready, if the budget shifts, if a new administration makes different choices, the wait will be longer still. What Artemis 3 does, or does not do, will determine whether this story has a second chapter. And as of the moment you are watching this, that question is genuinely open. And this brings us to April 1st, 2026. The rocket that Congress built is carrying 4 people beyond low Earth orbit for the first time in 53 years. This is where the 50-year story becomes immediate, personal, and, in a way that surprised me when I was researching this, genuinely moving. There is a particular kind of person who becomes a naval test pilot. Not better than other people. The test pilot community is full of people who would resist that framing and resist it correctly, but different in a specific way. They are people who have decided at some point in their formation that the most useful thing they can do with their professional life is fly experimental machines to the edges of their performance envelopes, note precisely what happens, and come back to report. They are comfortable with risk in the way that a surgeon is comfortable with blood, not because risk does not frighten them, but because they have organised their relationship with it into something they can work alongside without flinching. Reed Wiseman is that kind of person. He flew F/A-18 Hornets from carrier decks, which is already a profession that self-selects for a particular tolerance for the gap between what might happen and what you have prepared for. He then became a test pilot, which narrows that selection further. He then became an astronaut, flying to the International Space Station in 2014 aboard a Russian Soyuz capsule and spending 165 days in orbit. He then became NASA's chief astronaut, the person whose job was to evaluate every other astronaut's readiness for flight, to make the calls about who was prepared and who needed more time and who was not yet where they needed to be. He was, for 2 years, the person who decided whether other people were ready to go to space. On April 1st, 2026, Reed Wiseman strapped into the commander's seat of the Orion spacecraft atop the Space Launch System at Kennedy Space Center, and the question of his own readiness was no longer his to answer. To his right sat Victor Glover. Glover is also a naval aviator, also a test pilot, also a man who has calibrated his relationship with controlled danger over a career spent flying machines that are not fully understood until someone pushes them past their documented limits. He flew to the International Space Station in November of 2020 on the first operational crewed flight of the SpaceX Dragon capsule, spending 167 days aboard the station. On April 1st, 2026, Victor Glover became the first person of colour to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Not the first person of colour in space, Guion Bluford flew on the Shuttle in 1983, but the first to leave the gravitational neighbourhood of Earth entirely, the first to travel the distance that separates low Earth orbit from the genuine void, the first to go where only 24 humans had gone before, all of them white, all of them American. Behind Wiseman sat Christina Koch. Koch spent 328 consecutive days aboard the International Space Station between 2019 and 2020, the longest single spaceflight by a woman in history, a record that still stands. In October of 2019, she and fellow astronaut Jessica Meir conducted the first all-female spacewalk. Koch is an electrical engineer who spent years building space instruments before becoming an astronaut. A person who understands spacecraft not as vehicles she rides, but as systems she can read. On April 1st, 2026, she became the first woman to travel beyond low Earth orbit. In the 53 years between Apollo 17 and Artemis 2, no woman had ever been farther from Earth than the altitude of the space station. Koch changed that, and beside Koch sat Jeremy Hansen of the Canadian Space Agency. Hansen is a former CF-18 fighter pilot, a geologist, and on April 1st, 2026, a person making his first spaceflight. He had never been to the International Space Station. He had never experienced a launch. His first time leaving the planet was a mission that took him to the neighbourhood of the Moon. He became the first Canadian to travel beyond low Earth orbit, the first non-American to do so. And he did it on a debut. When Apollo 17 launched in December of 1972, the crew was Gene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ron Evans, 3 white male American military officers, which was not a criticism of those 3 men, but a description of the world that had produced them and the institution that had selected them. The astronaut corps of the Apollo era was what it was because the institutions feeding it were what they were. 53 years later, the crew sitting atop the same rocket on the same Florida coastline was a naval test pilot who had run NASA's astronaut program, the first person of colour beyond low Earth orbit, the first woman beyond low Earth orbit, and a Canadian rookie on his first flight to the Moon. The physics of the journey was identical. The question of who gets to be part of the story had changed entirely. At 6:35 in the evening on April 1st, the twin solid rocket boosters of the Space Launch System ignited at Launch Complex 39B, the same pad complex where Saturn V had roared away into night skies, where the Shuttle had launched 135 times, where decades of human ambition had left scorch marks on concrete that the Florida weather has never quite managed to erase. The vehicle generated 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, more than any currently flying rocket, more even than the Saturn V at the moment of ignition, though the Saturn V surpassed it as its fuel burned down and the vehicle lightened. The solid boosters separated 2 minutes in, their white exhaust columns diverging against the evening sky. The core stage engines burned for 8 minutes and cut off. The spacecraft separated cleanly. Orion and its interim cryogenic propulsion stage were in low Earth orbit, circling the planet at 28,000 kilometers per hour, and everything had worked. The crew spent approximately 90 minutes in that orbit, verifying systems, confirming that the solar array wings had deployed correctly, running through the checks that stood between them and the burn that would change everything. Then the propulsion stage fired for 5 minutes and 50 seconds. In those 5 minutes and 50 seconds, Orion accelerated from 28,000 km per hour to 39,400 km per hour, the velocity required to escape Earth's gravitational pull and coast to the Moon on a free return trajectory. The crew felt the sustained push of 1.2 gravities pressing them into their seats, not violent but insistent, the physical sensation of a journey beginning in the most irreversible sense. Then the engine cut off, the propulsion stage separated and drifted away, and Orion was alone. The free return trajectory is a gift from orbital mechanics to anyone who understands it. It requires no engine to complete. If every propulsion system on the spacecraft fails from this moment forward, every thruster, every engine, every backup, the laws of gravity will still carry the crew around the far side of the Moon and fling them back toward Earth in an arc that ends in the Pacific Ocean. It is the ultimate passive safety net, written into the physics of the journey rather than into any component that can malfunction. Gene Cernan flew a free return trajectory in December of 1972. Reed Wiseman's crew is flying one now, on a path that the Moon's gravity will complete whether anyone asks it to or not. Over the 4 days of the outbound coast, the Earth did what it does on every lunar mission. It shrank. Not quickly enough to watch minute to minute, but undeniably, hour by hour, the blue marble receded. The crew could cover it with a thumb held at arm's length by the 2nd day. By the 4th day, it was a disk in the window, beautiful and remote, surrounded by black in every direction. The Moon, ahead of them, grew from a bright point to a visible disk to something with features, the dark patches of the near-side Maria, the brighter highlands, the ancient surface detail that no atmosphere has ever softened. On approximately April 6th, Orion swung around the far side of the Moon. The communications link with Earth, delayed by 1.3 seconds each way even at the speed of light, giving every exchange with mission control a slightly disconnected quality that the crew had been living with for days, went silent entirely. 3,474 kilometers of solid rock stood between the spacecraft and every other human being alive. For approximately 45 minutes, the crew of Artemis II became the most isolated people in the history of the species. They were the 25th, 26th, 27th and 28th humans to see the far side of the Moon with their own eyes. William Anders had been the first, on Apollo 8 in December of 1968, and the view he recorded from that orbit, the Earth rising over the ancient cratered lunar horizon, became the most reproduced environmental photograph in history, Earthrise, the image that changed how humanity saw itself. The Artemis II crew flew a wider, more distant trajectory than Apollo 8, a flyby rather than an orbit, but the geometry of three celestial bodies, Sun, Earth, Moon, produced the same essential view. A small blue planet rising above grey silence, the only colour for 250,000 miles in any direction. And then the trajectory carried them around the curve and the blackout ended, and Mission Control's voice returned, slightly delayed, slightly formal, and the crew was in contact with home again. 4 days later, Orion hit the atmosphere at 40,000 kilometers per hour, Mach 32, the fastest crewed re-entry ever attempted. The heat shield, the Avcoat ablative material that had cracked and spooled during Artemis I, the material that NASA's investigation had identified 3 ways of killing a crew, the material that the program had addressed not by replacing it, but by changing the angle of approach, began to do its job. The exterior surface reached 2,760 degrees Celsius. A sheath of ionized plasma surrounded the capsule, blocking all radio communication for several minutes, wrapping the crew in a cocoon of superheated gas that glowed in the Pacific sky like a second sunrise. Inside the capsule, the crew felt the deceleration building. After 10 days of weightlessness, gravity returned, not gently, not gradually, but as a sustained force pressing them into their seats at 3, 4, 5 times the weight of Earth. Blood pooled in their legs, their chests felt heavy. The transition from zero gravity to high G is one of the most physiologically demanding things a human body can experience, and it was happening to people who had been floating for 10 days. Then the parachutes deployed. The drogues first, stabilizing the capsule. Then the 3 main chutes, each one 116 feet in diameter, blooming orange and white above the Pacific. The capsule swayed beneath them. The heat shield hit the water first, absorbing the impact in the crumple zones designed for exactly this moment. The USS San Diego was in position. Recovery swimmers approached. The hatch opened. If the heat shield held, if the modified trajectory had been enough, if the Avcoat had performed within the limits the engineers had calculated, then what entered the data stream from that re-entry was the proof of concept the program needed. A demonstration that the workaround worked, a foundation on which Artemis III could stand. If it had not held, the conversation would be different. But we will get to that in Chapter 10, whatever happens in the next few days, and as of the moment you are watching this. The mission is still in progress. There is something true about Artemis II that does not depend on the outcome. It is the product of 50 years of effort, failure, compromise, tragedy, and stubborn persistence. It represents every decision analysed in this video, good and bad, and it's carrying 4 people who have spent their careers preparing for a moment that the institution has been trying to reach, in one form or another, since December 14th, 1972. Go back to the Taurus Littrow Valley for a moment. It is there right now, in the same condition it was in on December 14th, 1972, when Gene Cernan lifted his boot from the surface for the last time and stepped onto the ladder of the lunar module. The footprint is pressed into grey regolith at a depth of perhaps a centimetre, the edges sharp and undisturbed, the texture of the soil preserved exactly as it was in the moment of impression. There is no atmosphere on the Moon to carry wind. There is no water cycle to bring rain. There is no biological activity of any kind to disturb the surface. The only forces that act on the lunar regolith are micrometeorite impacts, tiny particles of interplanetary dust striking at high velocity over geological timescales, and the slow grinding of thermal expansion and contraction as the surface cycles between the lunar day's 120-degree heat and the lunar night's 170-degree cold. At that rate of change, Cernun's footprint will still be recognizable in 10,000 years. It will still be there in a million. It will outlast every institution discussed in this video: NASA, the United States Congress, the presidency, the nation itself if nations prove to be temporary things, which history suggests they do. The footprint is more durable than anything that made it possible. And that durability has a quality that is not quite irony and not quite poetry, but sits somewhere between the two. The 53 years between that footprint and the Artemis II mission now circling the moon's neighbourhood are not a simple story. I want to be honest about that, because the temptation when telling a story of institutional failure is to let the failure become the whole narrative, and it is not. The Space Shuttle, for all the compromises baked into its design and all the pressure that produced 2 disasters and 14 deaths, also delivered the Hubble Space Telescope to orbit and then sent astronauts to fix it when its mirror turned out to be the wrong shape. It built the International Space Station module by module over 13 years. And that station has housed a continuous human presence in space for more than 25 years without interruption. It flew 135 missions and returned from 133 of them. It enabled a generation of science that would not otherwise have been conducted, carried experiments and satellites and observatories that expanded what humanity understood about the universe it inhabits. Constellation, for all the $9 billion it spent without flying a crew, produced the Orion capsule, the spacecraft that is carrying 4 people toward the moon right now as you watch this. It produced engineering knowledge, manufacturing techniques, and supply chain relationships that fed directly into Artemis. The money was not entirely lost. The work was not entirely wasted. The SLS, for all its $4.1 billion per flight and its 44% smaller payload than the Saturn V, flew. It launched on its first attempt and performed within its specifications, and sent an uncrewed Orion around the moon and back, and then it put 4 people beyond low Earth orbit for the first time in 53 years. These are not nothing. But the gap is also not a story of triumph, and pretending otherwise would be a different kind of dishonesty. 14 people died in disasters that 2 separate investigations found were produced by institutional failures that were known, documented, and unaddressed. The normalization of deviance that Diane Vaughan described after Challenger was found intact and operational after Columbia, 17 years later, in the same organization, producing the same outcome. Hundreds of billions of dollars were spent on programs, Constellation most visibly but others before it, that were cancelled before they accomplished their stated purposes, that left behind hardware in storage and knowledge in filing cabinets and workforces that had to be retrained for whatever came next. And 53 years passed between the last human footprint on the moon and the first human mission to return to its neighbourhood. That is not a gap that any honest account can dress up as an acceptable pace of progress. The honest question, the one that Artemis III will begin to answer and Artemis IV may finally resolve, is whether this program, this specific architecture built on political compromise and funded in annual increments by a Congress that has other priorities and short election cycles, can endure long enough to put people on the surface. The first crewed lunar landing since 1972 will come, if it comes, at least 56 years after the last one. Whether it comes at all depends on decisions that have not yet been made in budget committees that have not yet convened, in administrations that may or may not prioritize what their predecessors prioritized, in a geopolitical environment shaped partly by what China does between now and 2030. None of those variables are settled. All of them matter. In December of 1968, 4 days before Christmas, the crew of Apollo 8 became the first humans to orbit the moon. On their 4th orbit, as the spacecraft came around the far side and the Earth appeared above the lunar horizon, William Anders reached for a camera and took a photograph. The image he captured, a small blue, astonishingly fragile planet rising above the ancient grey curve of the moon, became known as Earthrise. It has been called the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. It appeared on the cover of magazines and in the windows of homes and on the walls of classrooms. It changed, in a way that is genuinely difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss, how humanity thought about its own home. The pale blue dot that Carl Sagan would later describe from 6 billion kilometers away was here seen from 250,000 miles, close enough to be beautiful, far enough to be humbling. When the crew of Artemis II swung around the far side of the moon on approximately April 6th of 2026, they saw the same view. Not from orbit, Their trajectory was a flyby, wider and more distant than Apollo 8's lunar orbit, but the geometry of the three bodies, Sun and Earth and Moon, produced the same essential image: a planet rising above silence, the only colour in a vast grey and black universe. The Artemis II crew are the inheritors of that original moment, and they carry it differently from the people who first saw it, because they come from a world that has already seen the photograph, already absorbed its lesson in the abstract, and now has to decide what to do with the understanding it produced. William Anders was the first. 24 humans saw that view between 1968 and 1972. Then, the silence. Then, 53 years later, 4 more. 28 humans in history, out of the approximately 117 billion who have ever lived, have seen the Earth rise over the lunar horizon with their own eyes. That number is either a monument to the rarity of the experience or an indictment of how slowly we have moved to expand it, depending on where you stand. What Cernun's footprint means, what it has always meant, sitting undisturbed in the Taurus Littrow Valley through every cancelled program and every budget crisis and every political redirection and every disaster investigation, is not a monument to success. It is a question pressed into the regolith and waiting. Are you coming back? Artemis II is the closest answer humanity has given in 53 years. Not a landing, not a base. Not the sustainable presence that Cernun's words implied when he said we would return with peace and hope for all mankind. But a crew of 4 people, in a spacecraft built from compromised politics and hard engineering, circling the neighbourhood of that question for the first time since he asked it. That is something. It is not everything. It is something. Gene Cernan said we would return, God willing. 53 years later, something that looks like the beginning of returning is actually happening. Whether it becomes a landing, a base, a presence, whether it becomes the thing Cernun's words implied, and the program's architects have promised, and the 14 people who died in its pursuit deserve to see completed, depends entirely on whether the political system that brought us this far can hold together long enough to take one more step. And that question does not have an answer yet. But I know what the next video is going to be about. If this video meant something to you, if you made it all the way from December of 1972 to April of 2026, then you already know whether it deserves a like. Hit it if it does. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling is worth recommending to someone else who might need it. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next chapter lands. This channel is built on exactly one principle: the full story, told properly, without cutting the parts that are complicated. There is more to come, and drop your country in the comments if you have not already. We have viewers joining from every part of the world tonight, and I want to know where you're watching from. The moon does not care about borders, neither does this story. Thank you for staying until the end. Gene Cernan would have appreciated the patience.